In the year 1315, it started to rain, and it didn't stop. This wasn't a storm, it was the sky breaking. For months, then for years, a relentless gray sheet of water fell over northern Europe, turning fertile fields into stinking, barren swamps and washing away the very foundations of society. The spring planting of 1315 was a sodden failure. The summer that followed was cold, dark, and wet. When autumn came, there was almost nothing to harvest. This was the beginning of the Great Famine, a slow-motion apocalypse that would last for years. As the grain rotted in the fields, the structure of their world rotted with it. Kings prayed in their chapels. Nobles locked the gates to their castles, hoarding what little they had. And the common folk, the millions who lived by the rhythm of the seasons, began to starve. At first they ate their seed grain, a fatal down payment on future hunger. Then they ate their dogs, their cats, their horses, and the rats in the thatch of their roofs. And then in the deepest, darkest pits of that starvation, a primal taboo was shattered. Whispers that passed through skeletal villages soon turned into horrifying entries in the chronicles of monks. Stories of parents looking at their own children with a new, terrifying hunger in their eyes. Stories of lonely travelers ambushed on the road, not for their money, but for their flesh. Tales of the desperate digging up the graves of the newly buried, driven by a need that erased all morality. It begs the ultimate question: how did the most powerful and pious civilization in the Christian world, a society that had built soaring cathedrals to God, descend into the ultimate act of desperation, eating its own people in just a couple of years? How did it all break down so completely and so fast? Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where we find that the line between civilization and savagery is only about 9 meals thick. So how did we get here? How does an entire continent, the heart of Christendom, the most advanced society of its time, find itself on the brink of cannibalism? To understand the sheer unmitigated horror of the Great Famine, you first have to understand the world that walked with a confident spring in its step right into the abyss. It was a world living on borrowed time, utterly and blissfully blind to the fact that its luck was about to run out in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Let's pull out the map. When we talk about the Great Famine, we're not talking about a small, localized drought. We're talking about a vast, contiguous swathe of northern Europe. Picture a wave of misery washing over everything from the soggy fields of Ireland across England, through the Low Countries and France up into Scandinavia, and deep into the heart of Germany and Poland. This was a continental-scale catastrophe, and to grasp it we have to understand the 3 pillars that held this world up, and why all 3 were rotten to the core. The first pillar, and the most important one, was a grand deception. It was the climate itself. We have this modern image of the Middle Ages as being perpetually dark, grim, and cold. It's an easy picture to paint. But for the 3 centuries leading up to our story, it was anything but. From about 950 AD to 1250 AD, Europe was basking in what climatologists now call the medieval warm period, or the medieval climate optimum. Let's be clear, it was a golden age of weather. The growing seasons were longer, the winters were milder, the frosts were less severe. You could grow wine grapes in southern England, for crying out loud. Think of it like a 300-year-long stock market rally, but for agriculture. The weather wasn't just good. It was reliable. For 10 generations, farming just worked. And with more food comes more people. A lot more people. Historians estimate that the population of Europe may have doubled or even tripled during this period. Humanity did what it does best: it expanded. People cleared ancient forests, drained marshes, and planted crops on every available scrap of land. They pushed into marginal territories high up on hillsides and far to the north, places that were only viable for farming because of the unusually wonderful weather. They built soaring cathedrals, founded new towns, and created a complex, interconnected society. They were brilliant. They were successful. And they had built their entire civilization on the naive assumption that the good times would last forever. It was a society that had become catastrophically over-leveraged against the weather, and the bill was about to come due with interest. This brings us to the second pillar of this fragile world, its very structure. A society built on the back of the feudal system. You have to understand this was not a world of supermarkets and global supply chains. For the overwhelming majority of people, let's be generous and say 95 out of every 100 you were a peasant. Your entire existence was tied to a small patch of land that you worked for a lord. Your wealth wasn't in a bank. It was in your grain bin. Your entire survival plan for the coming year depended on what you and your village could pull from the ground between June and September. There was no plan B. The entire system had zero shock absorption. There was no large-scale government relief program to call upon, no strategic grain reserve for the kingdom. The concept of importing vast quantities of food from overseas simply didn't exist in any meaningful way. If the harvest failed, you didn't just have a bad year where you had to tighten your belt. You faced oblivion. It's like running a global corporation where your entire year's revenue comes in on a single afternoon. And if it happens to rain that day, the company goes bankrupt, and every single employee starves to death. It is, to put it mildly, a terrible business model. And in 1315, it was about to face the ultimate stress test. And that leads us to the third and final pillar, the mind of the medieval man himself. You cannot understand the reaction to the Great Famine without understanding the software that was running in their heads. When the rains came in the spring of 1315 and simply never stopped, they didn't see a low-pressure weather system getting stuck over the North Atlantic. They saw the wrath of an angry God. To them, this wasn't meteorology. It was theology. They were living through Genesis chapter 7. This was the great flood all over again, a divine and deliberate punishment for their sins, for their greed, for their pride, for the fashions of the court, for anything and everything. Their response, therefore, wasn't practical. It was spiritual. They tried to solve a climate crisis with a religious solution. They organized solemn processions marching barefoot through the mud and rain. They fasted, which in a time of dwindling food seems somewhat counterproductive. They prayed, they donated what little they had to the church, all in a desperate attempt to appease the deity who had in their minds turned the heavens against them. And who were the people caught in this perfect storm? Well, let's meet the archetypes, the cast of characters in this tragedy. First, and most importantly, is the peasant family. We don't know their names. They are the anonymous millions who are the engine of this world and who will be its primary victims. They are the ones who feel this first. They watch their fields of barley and wheat turn to black slime. They see the prices at the local market skyrocket beyond their reach. They eat their draft ox, a decision that cripples their ability to farm next year, assuming there is a next year. They hear their children cry from hunger, a sound that will drive them to choices no human should ever have to make. Then you have the people at the top, like King Edward II of England. A king is supposed to be God's chosen figure of immense power, the shepherd of his people. But what is royal power against the sky itself? You can't command the rain to stop, and you can't eat gold. Chronicles tell us that even the king's own court struggled to find bread. On one occasion, the King and Queen of England were traveling and were unable to find or buy food for their own entourage. It's a stark reminder of the absolute helplessness that gripped everyone from the lowest serf to the highest sovereign. And finally, we have our eyewitnesses, the people we must thank for knowing any of this at all, the chroniclers. These were mostly monks, literate men, living in monasteries who watched the world outside their stone walls fall apart. With a chilling, detached horror, they recorded it all. They noted the price of wheat doubling, then quadrupling, then soaring to impossible heights. They described the strange sicknesses that swept through the weakened population. And later, they would write down the hushed, terrified rumors of what starving people were doing behind closed doors to survive. They are our horrified tour guides through hell. So there you have it. The stage is set. A world perfectly designed to shatter. A massive population balanced on a knife edge of good weather with no safety net, and a belief system that told them this whole catastrophe was their own damned fault. They were standing at the edge of a cliff, and in the spring of 1315 the sky gave them a firm and relentless shove. What happened next was not just a tragedy. It was the inevitable, horrifying result of a system that had reached its absolute breaking point. The stage was set. A bloated, overextended society utterly dependent on good weather was about to face a climate that had decided to stop playing nice. What followed was a slow, agonizing, and predictable descent into hell, a journey that can be broken down into 3 distinct acts of a world coming apart at the seams. It all began in the spring of 1315 with a farmer's worst nightmare. The rain, which had started the previous autumn, simply didn't stop. It wasn't a series of storms. It was a monotonous, soul-crushing, permanent state of being wet. The fields normally thawing and ready for the plow became vast lakes of mud. The soil was so waterlogged that planting was nearly impossible. The essential crops of medieval life, wheat, barley, oats, saw their seeds rot in the ground before they could even sprout. For the peasants who lived by the agricultural calendar, this was already a catastrophe. But they were a resilient people. They had seen bad springs before. They prayed, they hoped, and they waited for summer to dry things out. Summer never came. The rain continued, accompanied by a strange, unseasonable cold. The sun became a distant memory. Any crops that had managed to struggle out of the mud were stunted, pale, and pathetic. By late summer, a cold dread began to settle over Europe. This wasn't just a bad harvest. It was a non-harvest. In a world without global trade, the price of food is a simple equation of supply and demand. And as the supply vanished, prices across Europe didn't just rise, they went ballistic. Chroniclers recorded the price of wheat doubling, then tripling, then quadrupling in a matter of months. A single bushel of wheat, the very building block of life, soon cost what a poor laborer might earn in half a year. This is the moment the first truly fatal decision was made, a choice born of pure desperation. Families with their grain bins empty and winter approaching began to eat their seed grain. This is the grain you set aside to plant for the next year's harvest. It is your only hope for the future. Eating it is a form of agricultural suicide. It's like a shipwrecked sailor drinking seawater. It's a choice that alleviates the pain in the short term while guaranteeing death in the long term. But when your children are crying from hunger now, the future becomes a luxury you can no longer afford. As the miserable year of 1315 bled into the frozen nightmare of 1316, the hunger began to bite. The meager supplies from the phantom harvest were gone. The seed grain was gone. Society now began to eat its own infrastructure. The first to go were the draft animals. The oxen and horses that plowed the fields, the engines of the medieval economy, were slaughtered for their meat. This was another catastrophic decision, crippling any chance of a proper planting season if the weather ever did improve. But again, you can't eat a hypothetical future harvest. When the livestock was gone, the menu became progressively more grim. People ate their dogs and cats. Then they moved on to vermin, hunting rats and mice. They ate the bark from trees, boiled leather, and scraped moss from stones. Anything with the slightest hint of nutritional value was thrown into the pot. The social order began to fray. Crime exploded as starving bands of men roamed the countryside, robbing anyone who might have a hidden scrap of food. The bonds of community so vital for survival dissolved in a wave of fear and suspicion. And with malnutrition came its inseparable twin disease. With immune systems shattered by starvation, the population became a walking feast for pathogens. Epidemics of typhoid fever, dysentery, and other sicknesses we can't even identify swept through the continent. People were too weak to bury the dead, leaving bodies to rot in the streets, further spreading the pestilence. This wasn't just a famine anymore. It was a full-blown public health crisis. At this point, any sensible person might hope that things had finally hit rock bottom. But medieval Europe, as we have established, was no longer a sensible place. The worst was yet to come. The year 13 and 17 marks the descent into the final darkest circle of this inferno. This is the year the chronicles begin to speak in hushed and horrified tones of the last resort, the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. What had been unthinkable was now whispered about, and what was whispered about was eventually done. The evidence is not archaeological. We have no butcher sites, but literary. The accounts from chroniclers across Europe, from Ireland to Poland, are too numerous and too consistent to be mere rumor-mongering. They were recording the final breakdown of humanity. The reports were stomach-churning. They spoke of the poor digging up the newly buried bodies of the dead to cut away their flesh. They wrote of criminals in dungeons deprived of food turning on each other in a frenzy. The most horrific stories were of a kind of domestic terror. An Irish chronicler wrote that men and women were eating their own children for hunger. In the Baltic region of Livonia, another account states plainly that parents were devouring their children, while in other places children were simply abandoned in the woods to starve, a grim real-life echo of fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel. Travel became a death sentence. Sinister innkeepers, it was said, would murder their guests to serve their meat to other unsuspecting travelers. It was the complete inversion of the laws of hospitality. Every stranger was a potential threat, but also, horrifyingly, a potential meal. This was the final stage of societal collapse. It is the point where the definition of human becomes terrifyingly fluid. When the hunger is absolute, the rules that hold society together are not just bent, they are consumed. The long, agonizing wait for the harvest of 13 and 17 was not just a watch for signs of life from the soil, but a watch for what remained of the soul of Europe itself. So we've walked through the narrative of the horror. We've seen how a continent of millions was brought to its knees, reduced to the most primal and desperate acts of survival. The story of what happened is over. Now we get to the good part, the part where we stop being chroniclers and start being detectives. It's time to perform a historical autopsy on a dead continent, to peel back the skin of the story and diagnose the true cause of death. Because while the people of the 14th century saw the famine as a divine mystery, a punishment from an inscrutable God, the truth is far more clinical, far more fascinating, and in many ways, far more terrifying. Let's start by opening the original case file, the one written at the time. To the medieval mind, the explanation was glaringly, terrifyingly obvious. This was an act of God. Full stop. In their worldview, there was no such thing as a random, large-scale event. Everything that happened from the birth of a king to the failure of a crop was a direct expression of the divine will. The universe was a moral stage, and God was a very hands-on director. When the rains fell and the crops failed and the people starved, there was only one possible conclusion: God was angry. Humanity had sinned, and this was their punishment. Preachers and priests took to the pulpits delivering thunderous sermons listing the people's transgressions. It was the vanity of the nobility, the greed of the merchants, the indecent fashions of the women, the general moral decay of the world. The famine wasn't a tragedy. It was a correction. A brutal but necessary cleansing of a sinful world. A second great flood sent to wash away the wicked. This explanation was in its own way incredibly comforting. It wasn't easy, but it was simple. It provided a clear cause for an unimaginable suffering, and it even offered a solution, however ineffective: prayer, penance, and piety. You couldn't fight the weather, but you could appeal to the one who controlled it. This narrative gave them a sense of agency, however illusory. It framed their suffering not as a meaningless, chaotic event, but as a chapter in a grand divine story. It was the only explanation that made any sense to them. The only problem is it was completely wrong. The curse that fell upon them wasn't supernatural. It was a monster they had built themselves over centuries, and it was about to wake up. To find the real culprit, we need to look past the heavens and focus on the ground beneath their feet and the very systems they had created. We're going to examine 3 key pieces of evidence that show this wasn't a divine curse, but a perfect storm of climate change, systemic fragility, and catastrophic success. Exhibit A: the climate's betrayal. The first suspect in our investigation is the climate itself. For 300 years, as we discussed, Europe had been living in a climatic sweet spot, the medieval warm period. It was the geological equivalent of winning the lottery every single year for 10 generations. This long summer allowed their population to explode and their civilization to flourish. But the climate is not a benevolent constant. It's a fickle, chaotic system. And around the year 1300, something began to change. The long summer was ending. Europe was standing on the precipice of a new climatic era, one that would be colder, wetter, and far more volatile. We call it the Little Ice Age. The Great Famine of 1315 wasn't just a patch of bad weather. It was the opening salvo of this new, harsher reality. Scientists today can see the evidence clearly in ice cores from Greenland and in the rings of ancient trees. The data shows a dramatic shift. But even the people at the time could see the anecdotal proof. All across Europe, vineyards that had produced wine for centuries began to fail. Reports of major rivers like the Thames freezing over became more common. The grain-growing season, once long and reliable, became a short and risky gamble. What caused this dramatic global cooling? We don't know for sure, but there are theories. It could have been a series of massive volcanic eruptions somewhere in the world that threw tons of sunlight-blocking ash into the atmosphere. It could have been a cyclical lull in solar activity, a so-called solar minimum. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that the fundamental operating system of their world had changed, but nobody knew it yet. They were still trying to run the old software of expansion and growth in a new hostile environment that would no longer support it. The climate that had enabled their rise was now actively turning against them, and the Great Famine was its first and most brutal attack. They thought God had forsaken them. In reality, it was just the North Atlantic Oscillation. Exhibit B: the flaw in the foundation. So the weather turned bad, but bad weather doesn't automatically have to lead to mass cannibalism. The second, and arguably more important suspect, is the very structure of their society. They weren't just unlucky, they were fundamentally systemically fragile. Their greatest success, their massive population boom, had become their greatest vulnerability. This is a classic case of what's known as a Malthusian trap. The concept is simple: a population will grow exponentially while its ability to produce food grows much more slowly. Eventually, the population outstrips its food supply, leading to a catastrophic check-like famine or disease that brutally brings the numbers back down. Medieval Europe had walked right into this trap with its eyes wide open. By 1300, there were simply too many people for the land to reliably support with the technology they had. They had expanded onto every conceivable piece of farmland, including marginal lands that were only productive during the peak of the medieval warm period. When the climate shifted, these lands were the first to fail, and millions of people who depended on them were left with nothing. Furthermore, their agricultural system was shockingly inefficient. The majority of peasants farmed using an open-field system, where families worked scattered strips of land in a large communal field. It was a system designed for community fairness, not for maximum output or innovation. There was little incentive to experiment with new crops or techniques. They were overwhelmingly reliant on a monoculture of wheat and barley. There was no crop diversity, no safety net. When the rain came and ruined the wheat, there wasn't a backup crop of potatoes, which hadn't arrived from the Americas yet, to fall back on. It was an entire civilization that had, agriculturally speaking, put all of its eggs in one very soggy basket. They had created a magnificent, towering house of cards. The base was a single vulnerable food system. The structure was a massive, dense population. And for 300 years the weather had been perfectly still, so the tower grew higher and higher. The Great Famine wasn't the event that built the house of cards. It was just the first gust of wind that proved the entire structure was rotten and unstable to begin with. Exhibit C. The Skeleton's Testimony. Historical chronicles are one thing. They can be biased, exaggerated, or based on rumor. But the final piece of evidence is undeniable. It's written in the bones of the victims themselves. Archaeology and paleopathology, the study of ancient diseases, give us a grim physical testament to the suffering of this era. All across northern Europe, archaeologists have found mass burial pits dating precisely to the years 1315 to 1317. In London, excavations for a new office building uncovered a cemetery with thousands of skeletons stacked neatly in layers. Clear evidence of a population dying off faster than they could be properly buried. But it's what scientists find on the bones that tells the real story. Paleopathologists can read a person's life history from their skeleton. They look for something called Harris lines, which are thin lines of increased bone density on long bones that indicate periods where growth temporarily stopped due to malnutrition or severe illness. They examine teeth for enamel hypoplasia defects in the enamel that also signal severe nutritional stress during childhood. Skeletons from the generations leading up to 1315 are riddled with these markers. This tells us that even before the famine hit, a large portion of the population was already living on the edge of malnutrition. They were chronically unhealthy. Their bodies had no reserves left. When the famine struck, these weakened bodies were the first to succumb. The skeletons from the famine pits show the grim results. They are the silent, irrefutable proof that this was not a sudden affliction from God, but the tragic, predictable climax of generations of systemic poverty and poor nutrition. The bones don't lie. They are the final damning evidence against the idea of a simple act of God. They are the receipts for a society that had gone bankrupt. So when we close the file, what is our final diagnosis? What was the real killer? The killer wasn't a vengeful God in the heavens. The killer was a monster they nurtured on earth. The cursed chamber wasn't a mystical realm of divine punishment. It was the very world they had built. It was a deadly combination of three factors, a three-headed beast of their own creation. The first head was climate change. They had built a paradise on a climatic anomaly, and when the climate reverted to the mean, their paradise drowned. The second head was systemic fragility. They had a bloated population, an inefficient food production system with no diversity, and a complete lack of infrastructure to handle a crisis. Their success had made them complacent and incredibly vulnerable. And the third head was simply bad luck. They were the unlucky generation standing on the exact fault line when centuries of pressure were finally released. The Great Famine wasn't a punishment for their moral sins. It was the inevitable mathematical consequence of their ecological and economic sins. It was the brutal, logical outcome of a biological system pushing past its carrying capacity. The curse was overpopulation. The curse was monoculture. The curse was a society that had no margin for error in a world that is defined by it. That is the truly chilling lesson of the Great Famine. It wasn't a monster that came from the outside. It was a monster that grew from within. So our historical autopsy is complete. The case is closed. The verdict is in. The killer that brought Europe to its knees wasn't the wrath of a vengeful god. It wasn't a supernatural curse or a moral failing. The culprit was something far more tangible and, in a way, far more frightening. It was a perfect storm, a three-headed monster that the continent had unwittingly fed and nurtured for centuries. The truth is that medieval Europe was the victim of a Malthusian catastrophe. It was a classic textbook case of a population that had, through centuries of unprecedented success and blissful ignorance, outgrown its environment. They were struck by the first head of the beast abrupt climate change, the end of a 300-year party of good weather. They were crippled by the second, a fundamentally fragile social and agricultural system, one that lacked resilience, innovation, or any kind of safety net. And they were finished off by the third, the sheer crushing weight of their own overpopulation. The Great Famine wasn't a random tragedy. It was an appointment with mathematical destiny. But the story doesn't end when the rain finally stops and the harvests slowly, painfully begin to return. To understand the true significance of the famine, we have to look at its echo, at the long, dark shadow it cast across the rest of the 14th century. The immediate human cost was staggering, almost impossible to comprehend. While records, our patchy modern historians estimate that the Great Famine killed somewhere between 10% and 25% of the entire population of Northern Europe. Millions of people. In many towns and cities, the death toll was higher than that of many of the most famous plagues. It was a demographic cataclysm that fundamentally altered the landscape. Entire villages were abandoned, never to be reoccupied, their locations now just grassy mounds in the English or French countryside. But the effects went far deeper than just the death toll. The famine shattered the very bonds of trust that held society together. Think about it. For years, the people had prayed to God and the saints for deliverance, and their prayers went unanswered. This created a deep well of spiritual crisis and disillusionment with the church, an institution that had proven utterly powerless in the face of real-world catastrophe. Likewise, they had looked to their kings and lords, their secular protectors, who had also proven completely helpless. The authority of both church and state was profoundly damaged. The survivors of the Great Famine were a generation scarred by cynicism who had learned the hard way that when true crisis hits, you are on your own. Violent crime, which had exploded during the famine years, remained stubbornly high for decades afterwards. The trauma of what people had seen and done lingered, leaving a psychological wound on the collective consciousness of Europe. But the single greatest, most terrifying consequence of the Great Famine was this: it was just the opening act. If you want to understand the sheer world-shattering devastation of the Black Death, which would arrive just 30 years later in 1347, you have to understand the Great Famine first. The famine was the grim prologue to an even darker story. It was the artillery bombardment that came before the main infantry assault. For 7 years, it had pounded the population of Europe, leaving the survivors weakened, chronically malnourished, and immunologically vulnerable. The children who had survived the famine, who grew up with severe nutritional deficiencies etched into their very bones, were now the young adults who would face the plague. The Great Famine had left Europe a hollowed-out, weakened shell. It created a population that was perfectly primed for a new pestilence to sweep through it with breathtaking lethality. It's impossible to know for sure, but it is highly likely that the death toll of the Black Death, which killed anywhere from a third to a half of the entire population, was so high precisely because the generation it attacked had already been ravaged by the worst famine in 1,000 years. The famine loaded the gun, and the plague simply pulled the trigger. It was the 1-2 punch that brought the High Middle Ages to a definitive, screaming halt. So, what is the final enduring lesson we pull from this cursed chamber of history? It is a stark and humbling reminder about the nature of progress and the fragility of civilization. The people of the High Middle Ages thought they were on a permanent upward trajectory. They were building bigger cathedrals, forming more complex governments, and their numbers were growing year after year. They believed in their own way that they had mastered their world. And then the weather changed. The Great Famine is a brutal lesson in the difference between the power of man and the power of nature. A king can command armies, he can raise taxes, he can build palaces. But he cannot make the sun shine or the rain stop. The story reminds us that history is not just shaped by politics, by heroes, or by villains. It is often driven by far larger, more impersonal forces, by climate cycles, by ecological limits, by the simple, brutal biology of food and population. It shows with terrifying clarity how quickly the complex systems we rely on can collapse, and how thin the veneer of what we call civilization truly is when people get hungry enough. In the end, their greatest success was the very thing that doomed them. Their booming population, a sign of their mastery over the land, was the anchor that dragged them to the bottom when the tide turned. It's a powerful cautionary tale that resonates even today. It forces us to ask what assumptions our own complex global civilization is built upon. What good weather, literal or metaphorical, do we take for granted? Where are we over-leveraged, and what is our plan for when the rain inevitably begins to fall? The ghosts of the Great Famine whisper a timeless, cynical warning that the line between a golden age and a dark age is sometimes just a few degrees of temperature, and that the greatest monster is often the one we build ourselves, believing it to be a monument to our own success. Thank you for joining us in this particularly bleak, cursed chamber. What do you think is this one of history's most overlooked turning points? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to unlock more of history's darkest secrets, be sure to subscribe. The past is waiting.